Everything changed long before most people noticed. Most people still think what we're seeing is just another rough patch in modern dating. It is not. We are watching a slow shift in the way millions of people think about relationships, commitment, independence, and the value of peace. By the time most people realize how much has changed, the old way of looking at relationships may already be gone. Stay with me until the end because the biggest change is not what most people think it is. It is not about dating apps, social media, or politics by themselves. It is about what happens when enough people quietly decide they would rather walk away than keep playing a game they no longer believe they can win. If you have been enjoying these angry guy discussions and want to support the channel, you can click the join button and become a channel member. It is a great way to support what I do while getting access to exclusive content available and only to members. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that history changes only when governments pass laws or when major events dominate the headlines. That certainly matters, but history often changes much more quietly than that. Sometimes it changes because millions of ordinary people wake up one morning and decide they are no longer interested in living the way everyone expected them to live. Nobody organizes it, nobody appoints a leader. There is no official meeting. People simply begin making different decisions. They stop chasing the same goals. They stop believing the same promises. They stop investing their time and energy into things that no longer make sense to them. Eventually, those individual decisions become a social movement without anyone formally calling it one. That is why I think so many people misunderstand what is happening right now. They keep asking where all the men went. They ask why marriage rates continue falling. They ask why birth rates continue falling across much of the developed world. They ask why so many people say they are lonely while also refusing to enter relationships. They ask why younger generations seem hesitant to commit even when they openly admit they would like companionship. They search for a single answer because that would be comforting. Reality is much more complicated than that. There is no single explanation. Instead, there are dozens of smaller forces pushing in the same direction until together they create something much larger than anyone expected. For many men, one of those forces is simple exhaustion. Not necessarily physical exhaustion, although plenty of people are working harder than ever just to maintain the same standard of living. It is emotional exhaustion, financial exhaustion, mental exhaustion. There comes a point where someone begins asking a very simple question: is everything I am putting into this actually worth what I'm getting back? That question does not apply only to relationships, it applies to careers, friendships, businesses, and nearly every important decision people make. Once that question appears, it can be difficult to make it disappear. For decades, there was a fairly predictable script that many people followed: work hard, build a career, find someone to share your life with, buy a home if possible, raise a family if you wanted one, grow old together. It was never perfect, but enough people believed well, in that path that society largely organized itself around it. Today, that certainty has faded. Housing costs have climbed. Inflation has reduced purchasing power. Stable careers feel less stable. Technology has transformed how people meet each other. Expectations have changed. Trust has become harder for many people to build and easier to lose. That does not mean relationships are doomed. It means relationships now exist in a very different environment than they did 30 or 40 years ago. When the environment changes, people's behavior changes with it. That is true in economics. It is true in nature. It is true in human relationships. People adapt to incentives whether they consciously realize it or not. One thing I have noticed is that many men are no longer measuring success the way previous generations did. There was a time when success almost automatically included marriage. Today, there are plenty of men who define success very differently. They think about owning fewer things instead of more. They think about lowering monthly expenses instead of increasing them. They think about flexible work instead of climbing corporate ladders forever. They think about protecting their peace instead of constantly proving themselves to everyone around them. That shift is difficult for some people to understand because it challenges assumptions that existed for generations. If someone grows up believing every man ultimately wants the same life, it becomes confusing when many men begin making different choices. Some decide they would rather remain single than stay in a relationship that makes them consistently unhappy. Others focus on fitness, hobbies, investing, starting businesses, learning new skills, or simply building a quieter life. Those decisions are not always driven by bitterness. Sometimes they are driven by experience. Sometimes they are driven by practicality. Sometimes they are driven by the realization that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. That distinction deserves more attention than it usually receives. Society often treats solitude as though it automatically represents failure. It does not. There are people surrounded by others who feel profoundly isolated. There are also people living by themselves who experience genuine contentment because their daily lives reflect their own priorities. Solitude can be peaceful when it is chosen rather than imposed. Understanding that difference changes everything. Many people eventually discover that peace has tremendous value because they have experienced the opposite. Anyone who has spent years dealing with constant conflict understands this almost immediately. Once daily stress becomes normal, you stop recognizing how heavy it is until it disappears. Then something remarkable happens. The silence that once seemed uncomfortable starts feeling valuable. Time becomes valuable. Predictability becomes valuable. Financial stability becomes valuable. You begin asking yourself whether any future relationship would actually improve your life rather than simply changing it. That is a healthier question than many people realize. Every relationship should add something meaningful to both people's lives. If someone believes entering a relationship will automatically solve loneliness, financial problems, boredom, or a lack of direction, disappointment often follows. Healthy relationships tend to grow between individuals who already have purpose rather than hoping another person will create it for them. Economics also deserves far more attention in this conversation than it usually receives. Every discussion about modern relationships eventually runs into financial reality. Rent has increased dramatically in many places. Buying a home feels impossible for large numbers of young adults. Food costs more. Insurance costs more. Energy costs more. Healthcare costs more. Childcare costs more. None of those realities disappear simply because two people care about each other. When people feel financially secure, they often become more optimistic about long term commitments. When they feel financially squeezed from every direction, uncertainty naturally grows. People postpone marriage, they postpone children, they postpone major purchases. They become more cautious because making the wrong decision feels significantly more expensive than it once did. This affects everyone, not just one group. Men feel pressure to remain financially dependable. Women face pressure to succeed professionally while also navigating expectations surrounding family and relationships. Both sides frequently feel misunderstood. Both sides often believe the other has an easier path. Social media rarely helps because outrage spreads faster than nuance. Extreme examples receive millions of views, while ordinary healthy relationships rarely become viral. That creates a distorted picture of reality. Imagine someone whose understanding of aviation came entirely from watching airplane crash investigations. They might conclude flying is extraordinarily dangerous, even though the overwhelming majority of flights land safely every single day. Something similar happens online. Conflict receives attention because conflict is entertaining. Calm does not. Healthy communication rarely trends. Mutual respect rarely dominates recommendation feeds. The result is a constant stream of examples that convince people everyone is selfish, dishonest, or impossible to trust, even when that is not true. That does not mean people should ignore genuine warning signs. Quite the opposite. People should absolutely learn from the experiences of others. They should recognize unhealthy dynamics early. They should establish boundaries. They should avoid repeating mistakes. Wisdom often comes from paying attention before problems become permanent. The challenge is learning from cautionary tales without allowing them to become your entire worldview. One encouraging trend is that more people seem interested in personal responsibility than they were a decade ago. More people are learning practical skills. More people are paying closer attention to budgeting. More people are exercising consistently. More people are starting side businesses or exploring ways to generate additional income. None of those things guarantee happiness, but they do increase resilience. Resilience matters because difficult periods eventually arrive for everyone. The person who knows how to adapt usually suffers less than the person who assumes life will always remain comfortable. That lesson extends far beyond dating. It applies to employment, it applies to investing, it applies to technology, it applies to health. Every generation eventually discovers that certainty is temporary. The people who prepare for change instead of denying it usually navigate that change far more successfully. Perhaps the most interesting development is how quietly all of this has unfolded. There was no single moment when millions of people simultaneously announced they were changing course. Instead, there were countless individual decisions taking place behind closed doors. Someone decided not to download another dating app. Someone decided to spend Saturday improving their home instead of going out. Someone chose to invest money rather than impress strangers. Someone decided that protecting their mental health mattered more than chasing social approval. None of those choices make headlines by themselves. Together, they reshape culture. That is why this conversation is bigger than dating. It is really a conversation about incentives, expectations, and the lives people decide are worth building. Once someone discovers they can create a meaningful life without constantly seeking validation from others, their priorities often change permanently. They become harder to pressure. They become harder to manipulate. They become more selective about where they invest their time, money, and emotional energy. Whether someone ultimately marries or remains single, that shift in thinking may be one of the defining social changes of this generation. If you step back and look at the bigger picture, something becomes impossible to ignore. People often assume that culture changes because someone gives a speech, writes a book, or passes a law. Those things certainly influence society, but they rarely create change by themselves. Lasting change usually begins when ordinary people quietly adjust their behavior. They stop responding the way they used to. They stop rewarding the same incentives. They begin placing value on different things. Eventually, businesses notice, politicians notice, media organizations notice. Entire industries begin adapting to decisions that millions of individuals made independently. That is exactly why the current moment deserves more attention than it usually receives. It is not defined by one event, it is defined by countless personal decisions moving in the same direction. One of those decisions involves how people think about time. Time has become one of the most valuable resources anyone possesses because it is the only resource that cannot be replaced. Money can be earned again, investments can recover, skills can be learned, lost time never returns. As more people begin recognizing that reality, they become much more selective about who and what receives their attention. That applies to careers, it applies to friendships, it applies to entertainment, it certainly applies to relationships. The older people become, the more they understand that peace of mind is not something to gamble recklessly. Once someone experiences a calmer, more stable life, they naturally become cautious about introducing unnecessary conflict back into it. There was a period when many people believed being constantly busy automatically meant they were succeeding. Every hour needed to be filled. Every weekend required plans. Every spare moment had to be shared online. Somewhere along the way, many individuals started questioning that mindset. They realized activity and progress are not the same thing. Someone can remain incredibly busy while accomplishing very little that genuinely improves their life. Another person may appear quiet from the outside while steadily building financial security, improving their health, learning practical skills, and creating a future that is significantly more stable. The difference is not always obvious until years have passed. That realization has influenced the way many people approach relationships as well. Instead of asking whether they can find someone, they increasingly ask whether a relationship will genuinely improve the life they have already built. That question changes everything because it raises the standard for everyone involved. It encourages people to think less about appearances and more about compatibility, less about excitement and more about reliability, less about the immediate emotions and more about long term character. Those are not glamorous conversations, but they are often the conversations that determine whether two people can build something that lasts. Another factor that rarely receives enough attention is the growing appreciation for competence. There was a time when many people assumed convenience would continue expanding forever. Food could be delivered almost instantly. Information was always available. Services existed for nearly every inconvenience imaginable. While many of those conveniences still exist, recent years have reminded people that systems can become strained, prices rise, supply chains become disrupted, jobs change, technology evolves. Suddenly, practical skills become valuable again. Knowing how to repair something, cook, budget, negotiate, invest, or solve problems independently begins to matter far more than it did when everything seemed effortless. That shift has affected how many individuals define maturity. Maturity is no longer measured only by age or formal education. Increasingly, it is measured by resilience. Can someone remain calm under pressure? Can they adapt when circumstances change unexpectedly? Can they handle disappointment without falling apart? Can they solve problems instead of simply identifying them? Those qualities become much more attractive in every area of life because uncertainty has become one of the defining characteristics of the modern world. Social media often creates the illusion that confidence comes from constant certainty. In reality, genuine confidence usually comes from repeatedly overcoming challenges. Someone who has rebuilt after setbacks tends to approach future obstacles differently than someone who has rarely experienced meaningful adversity. They know difficult periods eventually pass. They know panic rarely improves outcomes. They know patience often produces better decisions than emotional reactions. Those lessons cannot simply be downloaded overnight, they are earned over time. Perhaps that explains why so many conversations today revolve around self improvement. Some critics dismiss the entire idea as a trend or a marketing strategy. Certainly, there are people attempting to profit from it. That happens in every industry. But underneath the marketing, there remains a very practical idea. Improving yourself is one of the few investments that continues paying dividends regardless of what happens around you. Better health improves nearly every aspect of daily life. Better financial habits create more options. Better communication strengthens relationships. Better emotional discipline reduces unnecessary conflict. Those improvements remain valuable regardless of economic conditions or changing cultural trends. Interestingly, many people discover that self improvement also changes the kinds of relationships they pursue. When someone lacks direction, almost any opportunity appears attractive. Once they establish meaningful goals, however, they naturally become more selective. They begin protecting routines that improve their lives. They avoid situations that repeatedly create unnecessary stress. They become willing to disappoint others if saying yes would require sacrificing their own well being. That is not selfishness. It is recognizing that constantly neglecting yourself rarely produces healthy outcomes for anyone involved. Another important change involves expectations surrounding happiness. Previous generations often assumed happiness arrived after reaching specific milestones. Graduate from school, find stable employment, get married, purchase a home, raise children, retire comfortably. Those milestones still matter to many people, but fewer individuals believe they automatically guarantee fulfillment. They have watched people achieve every traditional milestone while remaining deeply dissatisfied. That observation has encouraged many to search for something more sustainable than simply checking boxes. Purpose has become increasingly important because it provides stability when circumstances inevitably change. Careers change, relationships change, financial conditions change, health changes. A person whose entire identity depends on one role often struggles tremendously when that role disappears. Someone whose identity rests on broader principles usually adapts more successfully. They understand that purpose can exist in many forms: building something meaningful, helping others, creating value, learning continuously, maintaining integrity. Those pursuits remain available regardless of changing external circumstances. There's also an interesting contradiction emerging in modern culture. People have more ways to communicate than at any previous point in history, yet many report feeling less connected. Thousands of online interactions can occur without creating genuine closeness. A conversation that lasts hours may leave both participants feeling understood, while hundreds of brief messages accomplish almost nothing emotionally. Convenience has improved dramatically. Meaningful connection has become more complicated. That observation matters because meaningful relationships require attention that many people struggle to provide consistently. Modern life constantly competes for focus. Phones vibrate, notifications appear, news cycles never stop, entertainment is always available. Work increasingly follows people home through digital devices. Under those conditions, giving someone undivided attention almost feels unusual. Ironically, that attention has become one of the most valuable gifts anyone can offer another person. Economic uncertainty reinforces these challenges. When people constantly worry about paying bills, changing jobs, or keeping pace with rising expenses, emotional bandwidth naturally becomes limited. Stress influences patience, it influences communication, it influences optimism. Two people may genuinely care about each other while still finding themselves overwhelmed by pressures neither created individually. Understanding that reality encourages empathy rather than assuming every difficulty results from bad intentions. That is one reason broad generalizations rarely explain complicated social changes very well. Human beings are influenced by incentives, experiences, personalities, family backgrounds, financial circumstances, and countless other variables. Every trend contains exceptions. Every generation contains remarkable individuals alongside deeply flawed ones. Recognizing complexity does not weaken an argument, it strengthens it because reality is almost always more nuanced than slogans suggest. Still, acknowledging complexity should not prevent honest conversations. If people increasingly feel dissatisfied with modern dating, that deserves discussion. If trust has become more difficult to establish, that deserves discussion. If economic conditions discourage long term commitment, that deserves discussion. Pretending these issues do not exist helps no one. Solutions begin with accurately describing the challenges rather than ignoring them because they are uncomfortable. One encouraging development is that more people appear willing to question assumptions they inherited rather than accepting them automatically. Every generation receives advice from the generation before it. Sometimes that advice remains timeless. Sometimes it reflects circumstances that no longer exist. Distinguishing between those two categories requires careful thinking. Advice that worked exceptionally well 30 years ago may require significant adjustment today because housing markets, labor markets, technology, and social expectations have changed dramatically. That does not mean older generations have nothing valuable to teach. Quite the opposite. Their experiences remain incredibly important. The challenge lies in separating enduring principles from outdated strategies. Working hard remains valuable. Living within your means remains valuable. Treating others with respect remains valuable. Those principles survive changing circumstances. Specific tactics, however, often require adaptation because the environment itself has changed. Adaptability may become one of the defining strengths of the coming decades. Technology continues advancing rapidly. Artificial intelligence is transforming industries. Remote work has changed how millions earn a living. Entire career paths that seemed permanent are evolving before our eyes. Individuals who embrace continuous learning will likely possess a significant advantage over those expecting stability to return exactly as it once existed. That mindset extends naturally into personal relationships as well. Healthy relationships require adaptation because people themselves continue changing throughout life. The person someone marries at 25 will not be identical at 45. Careers evolve, priorities evolve, health evolves, dreams evolve. Long lasting relationships often succeed because both individuals remain willing to grow together rather than expecting everything to remain frozen in time. Unfortunately, many people underestimate the importance of personal accountability during that process. It is always tempting to believe every disappointment originated entirely with someone else. That belief offers temporary comfort because it removes responsibility. It rarely produces lasting growth. Honest self reflection is uncomfortable precisely because it requires acknowledging mistakes alongside successes. Yet that willingness to examine our own decisions often becomes the starting point for meaningful improvement. This applies equally to remaining single. Choosing independence should never become an excuse to stop growing. Solitude provides opportunities that constant distraction often hides. It allows people to examine habits honestly. It creates space to build discipline. It encourages financial planning. It allows individuals to develop interests that exist independently of external validation. Those benefits become even more meaningful when someone eventually enters a relationship because they arrive as a more complete person rather than expecting another individual to solve problems. They neglected themselves. There is another lesson worth considering. Quiet confidence tends to outlast loud certainty. Throughout history, people who constantly announced they had every answer were often surprised by reality. The individuals who remained curious, continued learning, and adjusted their views when evidence changed usually navigated uncertainty more successfully. Confidence built upon learning remains flexible. Confidence built upon ego often breaks when challenged. Perhaps that is why humility deserves far more respect than it often receives. Humility does not mean lacking conviction. It means recognizing that every person has blind spots. Every perspective remains incomplete. Every individual continues learning, regardless of age or experience. That attitude encourages better conversations because it replaces constant competition with genuine curiosity. Instead of asking how to defeat someone in an argument, people begin asking what they might learn from a different perspective. If enough individuals adopt that mindset, the future of relationships may become healthier than many currently expect. Trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned consistently over time. Respect cannot simply be requested, it grows through dependable actions. Stability cannot be manufactured overnight, it develops through countless ordinary decisions repeated consistently. Those truths have remained remarkably consistent despite every technological and cultural change society has experienced. Ultimately, the question facing many people today is surprisingly simple. What kind of life do you actually want to build? Not the life someone else expects, not the life designed to impress strangers, not the life optimized for photographs or short term approval. The life that allows you to wake up with purpose, maintain your integrity, protect your peace, contribute something meaningful, and build relationships rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. That question has no universal answer, but asking it honestly may be one of the most important decisions anyone can make. One pattern that becomes increasingly clear is that certainty has become a luxury. Previous generations often felt as though they could map out the next 20 or 30 years with reasonable confidence. They expected industries to remain recognizable. They expected communities to remain relatively stable. They expected the rules they learned early in adulthood to remain useful throughout most of their lives. That confidence has largely disappeared. Many people now expect disruption rather than stability. They assume technology will continue changing the workplace. They assume economic conditions will fluctuate dramatically. They assume entire industries may look completely different within a decade. Whether those assumptions prove entirely correct is almost beside the point because expectations shape behavior just as powerfully as reality itself. When people believe the future is uncertain, they naturally become more cautious about long term commitments. They save more or when they can. They avoid unnecessary debt. They hesitate before making irreversible decisions. This mindset extends well beyond finances. It influences friendships, careers, and relationships. Someone who believes the future is unpredictable often prioritizes flexibility. They want room to adapt rather than becoming trapped by choices they cannot easily reverse. That does not mean commitment has lost its value. It means commitment now competes against a world that constantly reminds people to prepare for uncertainty. This creates an interesting tension because human beings simultaneously crave stability and freedom. We want security, but we also want options. We want dependable routines, but we also fear missing opportunities. Those competing desires have always existed, yet modern technology amplifies them. Every day, people see countless examples of different lifestyles. One person is traveling the world while working remotely. Another is building a business from a spare bedroom. Someone else has left a high paying corporate job to pursue a completely different career. These stories inspire some people while making others question whether they are living the right life. Comparison has always existed, but it now happens at a scale previous generations could scarcely imagine. That constant comparison quietly changes expectations. Instead of evaluating their lives against neighbors or coworkers, people compare themselves with millions of carefully curated snapshots. They compare ordinary Tuesdays with someone else's highlight reel. They compare years of effort with moments of visible success. Even when people understand intellectually that social media presents an incomplete picture, emotions do not always follow logic. Doubt slips in anyway. People begin wondering whether they are falling behind, even when they are making steady progress. Progress itself has become strangely underrated. Modern culture often celebrates dramatic transformations while overlooking consistent improvement. A viral success story receives enormous attention. A person quietly paying off debt over several years rarely attracts notice. Someone steadily exercising 3 times a week does not generate exciting headlines. A family carefully saving for the future is not particularly entertaining. Yet, those ordinary habits often produce the strongest long term outcomes. Sustainable success is usually built through repetition rather than dramatic moments. This matters because relationships also depend upon ordinary consistency. Grand gestures may create memorable moments, but daily reliability builds trust. Showing up when promised, communicating honestly, handling disagreements respectfully, remaining dependable during difficult periods. These qualities rarely become trending conversations because they appear almost boring from the outside. Yet they often determine whether relationships thrive or gradually deteriorate. Excitement attracts attention. Stability sustains partnerships. Many discussions about modern relationships overlook another important reality. People's expectations are often shaped by environments that no longer exist. Advice that made perfect sense when communities remain geographically stable becomes more complicated when careers require relocation every few years. Expectations developed during periods of affordable housing become more difficult when purchasing a home requires dramatically greater financial resources. Every generation inherits traditions, but every generation must also decide which traditions remain practical under new conditions. That process inevitably creates disagreement. Some people interpret changing expectations as progress, others interpret them as decline. In truth, history rarely moves in perfectly straight lines. Every era solves certain problems while creating new ones. Expanding opportunities often introduces new pressures. Greater individual freedom can also produce greater individual responsibility. Technological convenience frequently creates unexpected trade offs. The challenge is resisting the temptation to imagine that either the past or the future offers perfect solutions. Every period presents unique advantages alongside unique difficulties. One encouraging sign is that more individuals appear interested in building lives that are intentionally designed rather than simply inherited. Instead of asking what everyone else expects, they ask what actually aligns with their own values. Some choose demanding careers because they genuinely enjoy them. Others deliberately simplify their lives to reduce financial pressure. Some pursue marriage and large families. Others remain single while investing deeply in friendships, creative work, or community involvement. The important point is not that everyone chooses the same path. The important point is making those choices deliberately rather than drifting through life on autopilot. Living intentionally requires saying no much more often than people expect. Every meaningful yes usually requires several meaningful no decisions. Choosing one career often means declining another. Prioritizing health may require sacrificing certain habits. Building financial stability frequently involves delaying purchases that provide only temporary satisfaction. Even relationships involve opportunity costs because investing deeply in one person necessarily reduces the time available for countless other possibilities. Recognizing these trade offs encourages wiser decisions because it reminds us that every choice carries consequences, whether immediate or delayed. Delayed consequences are particularly important because modern culture often emphasizes immediate gratification. Companies compete fiercely for attention. Entertainment is available instantly. Products arrive quickly. Answers appear within seconds. Under those conditions, patience almost feels old fashioned. Yet many of life's most valuable achievements still operate according to much slower timelines. Trust develops gradually. Expertise requires years of practice. Financial independence often results from decades of disciplined decisions. Strong reputations emerge through repeated integrity rather than isolated actions. Nature has not adjusted its pace simply because technology has accelerated ours. This difference between fast rewards and slow rewards may explain why many people feel increasingly dissatisfied despite unprecedented convenience. Immediate pleasure and lasting fulfillment are not identical experiences. One fades quickly, the other accumulates quietly. Finishing a difficult project often feels more meaningful than endless entertainment because accomplishment satisfies something deeper than distraction. Helping another person creates a different kind of satisfaction than receiving temporary approval online. Investing consistently over many years eventually produces freedom that impulsive spending rarely provides. These lessons become clearer with age because experience repeatedly demonstrates the difference between what feels good today and what remains valuable years later. Another area deserving attention is the changing definition of success. For a long time, success was often measured externally: income, job titles, expensive possessions, large homes, luxury vehicles. None of those things are inherently negative, but many people eventually realize they reveal surprisingly little about someone's actual quality of life. A person may appear extraordinarily successful while carrying immense stress. Another may live modestly while enjoying excellent health, meaningful friendships, financial stability, and tremendous peace of mind. Determining which life represents greater success depends entirely upon the values being applied. Economic uncertainty has encouraged many people to reconsider those values. Rising living costs force difficult questions about priorities. Is a larger home worth decades of additional financial pressure? Is constant consumption actually improving happiness? Does owning more automatically create a better life? These questions have led many individuals toward greater simplicity. Minimalism means different things to different people, but its underlying principle remains remarkably practical. Remove unnecessary obligations so more energy becomes available for what genuinely matters. Minimalism extends beyond physical possessions. It also applies to schedules, commitments, digital habits, and emotional energy. Every unnecessary obligation consumes attention that could be invested elsewhere. Constantly chasing approval becomes exhausting because approval continually shifts. Building life around stable principles provides a stronger foundation than chasing trends that change every season. Individuals who understand this often appear calmer because they spend less energy reacting to every passing controversy. Calmness should not be mistaken for indifference. Remaining emotionally steady does not mean ignoring important issues. It means refusing to surrender control of your attention to every headline demanding immediate outrage. The modern information environment rewards emotional reactions because strong emotions generate engagement. Fear spreads rapidly, anger spreads rapidly, optimism generally spreads much more slowly. That imbalance creates the impression that society is constantly approaching disaster, even during periods when many positive developments are occurring simultaneously. Maintaining perspective, therefore, becomes an important skill. Serious challenges absolutely deserve attention. Rising costs deserve attention. Mental health deserves attention. Declining trust deserves attention. Yet recognizing progress remains equally important. Medical technology continues advancing. Educational resources are more widely available than ever before. Entrepreneurship has become accessible to millions who previously lacked opportunities. Remote collaboration allows talented individuals to work with people across the world. These developments matter because balanced thinking requires acknowledging both problems and progress. Balance also improves conversations. Productive discussions rarely emerge when participants assume the worst about one another. Most people are trying to build meaningful lives despite facing different constraints and experiences. They may disagree strongly about solutions, but disagreement alone does not require hostility. Healthy societies depend upon individuals who remain capable of discussing difficult subjects without immediately reducing each other to stereotypes. That ability becomes increasingly valuable as public conversations grow more polarized. Perhaps one reason polarization has intensified is that certainty feels emotionally comforting. Complex explanations require patience. Simple explanations provide immediate clarity, even when reality is far more complicated. Blaming one institution, one generation, one ideology, or one demographic for every problem may feel satisfying temporarily, but it rarely survives careful examination. Human societies operate through countless interconnected systems. Economic incentives influence cultural behavior. Cultural behavior influences political decisions. Political decisions influence markets. Markets influence family formation. Each factor shapes the others continuously. Recognizing those connections encourages humility because it reminds us that lasting improvements usually require cooperation rather than permanent conflict. Communities become stronger when individuals contribute consistently rather than waiting for perfect conditions. Families become stronger through reliability rather than perfection. Businesses succeed by solving genuine problems instead of merely attracting attention. Nations become more resilient when citizens develop practical skills alongside strong character. None of these ideas are particularly glamorous, but history repeatedly demonstrates their importance. Character itself may become one of the defining advantages of the coming decades. Skills remain essential, but skills without integrity often produce short lived success. Trustworthy individuals continue receiving opportunities because reliability remains surprisingly uncommon. Employers value people who consistently fulfill commitments. Friends value honesty. Partners value dependability. Communities value those willing to contribute rather than merely criticize. Character quietly compounds in much the same way investments do. Small decisions repeated over many years gradually shape reputation until reputation begins opening doors that talent alone cannot. That understanding changes how someone approaches everyday life. Instead of asking how quickly they can achieve recognition, they begin asking what kind of person they are becoming through repeated decisions. Every promise kept strengthens discipline. Every difficult conversation, handled respectfully, strengthens maturity. Every setback, faced without surrender, strengthens resilience. These improvements often occur gradually enough that individuals scarcely notice them until looking back years later. Looking back also reveals something else. Many fears that once seemed overwhelming eventually became manageable because people adapted. Adaptation is one of humanity's greatest strengths. We learn, we adjust, we rebuild, we discover abilities we did not know we possessed until circumstances required them, remembering that history can provide confidence during uncertain times, because previous generations repeatedly overcame challenges that once appeared impossible. The future will undoubtedly introduce new obstacles. Technology will continue evolving. Economies will continue changing. Social expectations will continue shifting. Yet the qualities most likely to help individuals navigate those changes remain remarkably familiar: discipline, patience, curiosity, integrity, adaptability, responsibility. These principles are not exciting because they are ancient, but their age is precisely what makes them trustworthy. They have survived changing civilizations because they consistently produce stronger individuals capable of building stronger communities. Ultimately, every generation receives the same quiet invitation: accept reality as it exists today rather than wishing endlessly for yesterday or fantasizing constantly about tomorrow. Build where you stand, improve what you control, strengthen your character, protect your peace without becoming isolated from the world. Invest in people who consistently demonstrate mutual respect. Create a life that remains meaningful even when circumstances become uncertain. That approach may never produce the loudest applause, but it often creates something much more valuable: a life built upon principles sturdy enough to withstand changing times. As the conversation comes to a close, it is worth remembering that every major social shift looks obvious only after it has already happened. While it is unfolding, it feels confusing. People argue about symptoms instead of causes. They blame individuals when incentives have changed. They assume things will eventually return to normal simply because that feels comforting. History rarely works that way. Once enough people change how they think, the old system does not simply reappear. Something new takes its place. Whether that new reality proves better or worse depends largely on the choices people make from this point forward. Perhaps the biggest lesson is that no one is owed another person's time, attention, commitment, or affection. Those things are earned through trust, consistency, respect, and shared purpose. That truth applies equally across the board. Relationships built upon obligation eventually become fragile because obligation cannot replace genuine appreciation. When two people remain together because they genuinely improve each other's lives, the foundation is much stronger than if they remain together because they fear loneliness, social judgment, or financial dependence. The strongest relationships are voluntary every single day. Each person continues choosing the other, not because they must, but because they believe their life is better with that person in it. That idea changes the conversation entirely. Instead of asking why someone should commit, perhaps the better question is what makes commitment worthwhile. That answer cannot be demanded, it must be demonstrated. Trust grows through honesty, respect grows through actions, stability grows through discipline, kindness grows through daily decisions rather than dramatic speeches. These are remarkably simple ideas, but simple should never be confused with easy. They require patience, humility, and consistency over long periods of time. One unfortunate habit in modern culture is expecting immediate certainty. People want guarantees before taking risks. They want complete confidence before making decisions. They want promises that nothing difficult will ever happen. Life has never offered those guarantees. Every worthwhile pursuit contains uncertainty. Starting a business involves uncertainty. Changing careers involves uncertainty. Building friendships involves uncertainty. Relationships involve uncertainty. The goal is not eliminating risk entirely because that is impossible. The goal is becoming the kind of person capable of handling risk wisely without allowing fear to make every important decision. That mindset naturally encourages preparation instead of panic. Someone who prepares for uncertainty usually experiences less fear because they know they have options. Financial savings create options. Practical skills create options. Physical fitness creates options. Emotional maturity creates options. Strong friendships create options. None of these things eliminate hardship, but together they dramatically improve resilience. Resilience often becomes the difference between someone who recovers from setbacks and someone who remains trapped by them. It is remarkable how often genuine confidence comes from preparation rather than personality. Many people mistake confidence for charisma. Real confidence usually comes from competence. The individual who has practiced consistently approaches challenges differently because they trust the work they have already done. That principle applies almost everywhere. The skilled craftsman trusts experience. The disciplined investor trusts long term strategy. The prepared speaker trusts careful preparation. Confidence becomes the natural result of repeated effort rather than empty optimism. That observation leads to another important point. External validation is an unstable foundation for self worth because it constantly changes. Public opinion changes, trends change, algorithms change, fashion changes, popular ideas change. If identity depends entirely upon approval from strangers, life becomes emotionally exhausting because strangers never stop changing their minds. Building identity around principles instead of applause creates far greater stability. Integrity remains valuable regardless of changing public opinion. Honesty remains valuable regardless of trends. Reliability remains valuable regardless of economic cycles. Those qualities continue paying dividends long after temporary recognition disappears. Many people eventually discover that freedom carries responsibilities often overlooked during discussions about independence. Freedom means accepting ownership of decisions rather than expecting someone else to rescue us from every consequence. That applies to careers, finances, health, and relationships alike. Personal responsibility is demanding because it removes convenient excuses. At the same time, it is empowering because it reminds us that our choices still matter even when circumstances remain imperfect. We may not control every event that enters our lives, but we always retain influence over how we respond. Response matters because adversity reveals character in ways comfort rarely can. Difficult periods expose habits, priorities, and values that remain hidden during easier times. Financial challenges reveal spending habits. Professional setbacks reveal perseverance. Personal disappointment reveals emotional maturity. These experiences are rarely enjoyable while they are happening, yet many people later recognize them as periods that shaped their strongest qualities. They became more disciplined because circumstances required discipline. They became more patient because quick solutions were unavailable. They became more grateful because they learned not to take stability for granted. Gratitude itself deserves greater attention because it quietly changes perspective. Gratitude does not require pretending problems do not exist. It simply recognizes that difficulties and blessings often exist simultaneously. Someone may be facing financial pressure while still enjoying good health. Another may be rebuilding after disappointment while surrounded by loyal friends. Recognizing these realities prevents cynicism from becoming permanent. Hope survives more easily when people remember that setbacks rarely define an entire life. Communities also play a larger role than many realize. Human beings are remarkably resilient individually, But healthy communities multiply that resilience. Encouragement matters, accountability matters, shared knowledge matters, practical advice matters. The strongest communities rarely form because everyone agrees about everything. They form because members share enough common values to support one another during difficult periods. Respectful disagreement strengthens communities far more effectively than constant hostility because it encourages learning rather than division. Learning has become one of the most valuable habits anyone can develop because change continues accelerating. The individual who remains curious gains a tremendous advantage over the individual convinced they already know everything worth knowing. Curiosity opens doors, it encourages better questions, it exposes flawed assumptions before they become costly mistakes. Every meaningful improvement begins with someone willing to admit there is still something left to learn. That lesson extends naturally into conversations about relationships. Listening often accomplishes more than assuming. Honest questions often reveal more than confident accusations. Every individual arrives carrying experiences invisible to everyone else. Understanding those experiences requires patience rather than rushing toward conclusions. Strong communication rarely depends upon having the perfect argument. More often, it depends upon creating an environment where truth can actually be spoken without immediate condemnation. Respect remains central because it cannot be replaced by appearances, status, or wealth. Respect grows when words and actions consistently align. It grows when promises are fulfilled. It grows when people demonstrate fairness, even when fairness costs them something. Respect built this way tends to endure because it rests upon observable behavior rather than temporary emotion. That kind of respect strengthens every relationship worth having, whether personal, professional, or within a community. One of the quieter changes taking place today is that more individuals appear interested in living according to their own values instead of constantly performing for public approval. Some people choose larger social circles, others prefer a handful of dependable friends. Some pursue ambitious careers, others deliberately simplify their lives. Some marry, others remain single. None of these choices automatically determine whether someone will experience fulfillment. Fulfillment depends far more upon living consistently with deeply held principles than following whatever path currently receives the loudest applause. That consistency creates something increasingly rare: inner stability. Stable people do not avoid every hardship, they simply avoid allowing every hardship to redefine them. They remain teachable without becoming directionless. They remain confident without becoming arrogant. They remain optimistic without ignoring reality. Finding that balance is difficult precisely because extremes often receive more attention. Yet balanced individuals frequently build the strongest lives because they resist being pulled dramatically from one emotional reaction to the next. History offers a useful reminder here. Every generation believes its challenges are entirely unique. In some ways, they are. Technology changes, economics change, politics change, yet human nature remains remarkably familiar. People continue searching for meaning, they continue seeking belonging, they continue hoping to build lives that matter. Those desires have connected generations for thousands of years, despite enormous differences in circumstance. Remembering that continuity can reduce unnecessary despair because it reminds us that previous generations also faced uncertainty while still managing to create meaningful lives. Meaning often emerges through contribution rather than consumption. Buying another product provides temporary excitement. Solving a meaningful problem creates lasting satisfaction. Helping another person creates lasting satisfaction. Building something useful creates lasting satisfaction. Teaching a valuable skill creates lasting satisfaction. Contribution gives people a sense that their efforts extend beyond themselves, and that feeling often becomes one of the strongest sources of long term fulfillment. As people become more intentional about their lives, they may also become more selective about the relationships they build. Selective should never mean cynical. It simply means recognizing that time and emotional energy remain limited resources. Investing those resources wisely becomes increasingly important with age because experience teaches how difficult they are to replace once wasted. Healthy boundaries, therefore, become acts of wisdom rather than hostility. They protect what matters most without requiring bitterness toward anyone else. If there is one final observation worth making, it is that peace should never be confused with passivity. Peace often requires difficult decisions. It may require leaving unhealthy situations, it may require admitting mistakes, it may require changing long established habits. It may require disappointing people whose expectations no longer align with reality. Genuine peace is usually built deliberately rather than discovered accidentally. It emerges from aligning daily choices with deeply held values instead of constantly reacting to external pressure. The future will almost certainly surprise everyone. New technologies will emerge. Economic conditions will shift. Cultural conversations will continue evolving. Predictions will prove correct in some areas and completely wrong in others. Rather than attempting to control every external change, perhaps the wiser goal is strengthening the qualities that remain valuable under nearly every circumstance: integrity, discipline, patience, curiosity, courage, responsibility, gratitude. These principles have survived countless generations because they continue helping ordinary people navigate extraordinary times. At the end of the day, every person eventually reaches a moment where excuses lose their usefulness. The question becomes straightforward: what kind of life are you building today that your future self will appreciate tomorrow? Are your daily habits moving you closer to stability or further away from it? Are your decisions creating greater freedom or greater dependence? Are you investing your time in pursuits that genuinely matter or allowing constant distraction to quietly consume the years? Those questions are not always comfortable, but they are worth asking because honest answers often become turning points. None of us controls the entire direction of society. We do, however, control many of the choices that shape our own lives. We control how we treat others. We control whether we keep learning. We control whether we honor our commitments. We control whether we allow disappointment to make us permanently bitter or whether we use it as motivation to become wiser and stronger. Those decisions accumulate quietly until one day we realize we have built a life reflecting exactly what we practiced repeatedly. To everyone who made it all the way to the end, a huge shout out to the 1 hour gang. I genuinely appreciate you spending your time here because time is the one resource none of us ever gets back. If you have been enjoying these Angry Guy discussions and would like to support the channel, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It genuinely helps support future content. I would also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about everything we discussed today? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or do you think the truth lies somewhere in the middle? Leave a comment and share your perspective because thoughtful conversations are often where the best ideas begin. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.